Hey YouTube. Okay, I don't know about you guys, but I'm sick of atheists diminishing Christian intellect.
You can't stand the heat, you better stay out of the kitchen.
Hello everyone, I'm Professor Plink. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. Today we're going to be looking at a video from the YouTube channel State of Daniel, who seems to primarily do political content, but will occasionally dip his toe into other topics, and this time around he's decided to talk a bit about how atheists are wrong to malign religious faith. In fact, this entire video from Daniel is going to be a defense of faith in general. And having not even watched it yet, I'm going to bet that he falls into the same pit that most theists do when trying to defend the idea of having faith. And that is not properly defining his terms and then conflating totally different definitions of the word faith during the argument. See, because the word faith, like many words, is polysemous, meaning that it has more than one meaning. And religious faith tends to mean something very different from, say, being faithful in a relationship or having faith in a predicted outcome based on the evidence at hand. And so I'm actually going to start off by defining terms, something that you rarely see out of your average religious apologist. So yes, faith has several different meanings, including 1, allegiance to duty or a person, loyalty, fidelity to one's promises, sincerity of intention. This would be the kind of faith that one would have in a monogamous relationship, being faithful to your partner. Then 2, belief and trust in and loyalty to God. Belief in the traditional doctrines of a religion. Firm belief in something for which there is no proof. Complete trust. Now this is something totally different. This is conviction of something for which there is no proof. Said it right there in the definition. So this falls completely in line with how the Bible describes faith in Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. So there is a clear distinction between faith in general and religious faith. And while we atheists may have a problem with religious faith, that doesn't mean that we have a problem with any and all faith of any kind. But I have a sneaking suspicion that Daniel is going to be attempting to blur the lines between them in his defense of religiosity here. But now that we have our terms defined, let's get into it and hear what Daniel has to say in defense of faith. But before we get to that, if you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. Check out my social media, including my Patreon and Twitter and Blue Sky, all linked in the description. And of course, like this video, pop in a comment. All that goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm. That thoughtful, tenacious truth teller, trusting tangible truths, testing theories through time, thus transcending traditional, tiresome theistic tales and their tepid, tiresome tropes, may keep my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video.
There's this notion that atheism and science rely on evidence, whereas religion relies on blind faith. Two things are wrong about that assertion. Number 1, there's an incredible amount of evidence behind any major religion, particularly Christianity.
Only if you're playing fast and loose with what constitutes as evidence. I mean, technically speaking, anything that gives even the faintest amount of weight to a proposition or claim could be counted as evidence. A person waking up from a dream and saying they saw God in their dream, telling them that Christianity was the one true religion, could be considered evidence. Finding a scrap of paper on the side of the sidewalk that says Jesus is Lord could be considered evidence. Seeing what is believed to be the Virgin Mary in a water stain could be considered evidence.
Guys, come here, check this out. Look!
What?
That is the Virgin Mary.
What? Oh, take it easy, bro.
Look, the head and the arms and the...
But there's a difference between good evidence and bad evidence. There's a difference between empirical evidence, which is considered reliable because it's observable, repeatable, testable, and a host of other ways to gauge its reliability. And then there's other lines of evidence that require more willing acceptance without reliable lines of provability. Evidence that's more theoretical, or emotionally motivated, or opinion-based. So that person waking from the dream, having seen God telling them about the truth of Christianity, well, what separates that dream from the one I had the other night about centaur clowns singing show tunes while throwing cupcakes at my crotch? What makes one valid and the other the deranged mental conjurings of a madman? Of course, the deranged mental conjurings would be that person who had the dream about God, obviously. And that scrap of paper that says Jesus is Lord that was found on the side of the sidewalk, that could easily be something some Christian scratched out on a napkin and then tossed on the sidewalk based on nothing more than the opinion of that writer. And of course, the stain is just a stain, and the phenomenon of pareidolia is what's making you see the Virgin Mary. Pareidolia being a psychological phenomenon that causes people to see patterns or faces in things that aren't there. I was a Christian for over 30 years, and though I was convinced of Christianity throughout most of that time, when I started actually using a critical lens to examine all of the so-called evidence for Christianity, I found that all of it, every shred and scrap of it, to be wanting in terms of being able to be considered the belief that Christianity is rationally demonstrated through the evidence.
Number 2, science has required, requires, and will require faith. Many advances made in science happened because some of the greatest minds in history employed faith to pursue those frontiers.
And here is where we get into the difference between faith and faith. The only way that the scientific method employs what could be constituted as faith is in the forming of a hypothesis. It's when a researcher comes up with an idea to explain a given phenomena that has not yet been borne out by the evidence. I suppose if I were being generous to the point you're trying to make, Daniel, that could be considered a kind of faith. However, it is significantly different from the religious version of faith, which again, remember, is the assurance of things hoped for and a conviction of things not seen. When a researcher employing the scientific method comes up with a hypothesis, they then have to actually do their due diligence and test out the hypothesis to make sure it can be validated with the evidence. When Jean-Joseph Leverrier hypothesized the existence of Neptune, he didn't just say, "Yeah, I'm sure there's another planet out there somewhere because I feel it in my soul," and then moved on with his life. No, he and other astronomers did lots of calculations using observable gravitational effects to hypothesize the existence of another, as yet undiscovered planet, and then they calculated where it would be, and that hypothesis wasn't verified until that planet was actually found and observed directly to exist. And this is how all of science works. When Georges Lemaitre, the Catholic priest who first hypothesized the Big Bang Theory, came up with the Big Bang Theory, he didn't just say that he was taking it on faith as described in Hebrews 11:1, or that God had spoken to him and told him that everything expanded from a hot, dense primordial singularity. He actually had to do a lot of work within the realm of physics and work with lots of others and study and experiment for years. And even then, Big Bang cosmology wasn't really validated until the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation in 1964. See, science doesn't rely on the conviction of things not seen. Any unsubstantiated hypothesis must be rigorously tested and must conform to all of the evidence. Christianity, and any religion for that matter, doesn't even attempt to hold itself to such a standard.
Furthermore, science requires faith because assumptions are made all the time, and they're usually assumptions that scientists can't prove. For instance, we assume that we can generalize future laws based on past laws. But what would happen if we woke up tomorrow and gravity wasn't working, or the Earth suddenly reversed orbit? Science would be screwed if the laws of physics were suddenly different.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Daniel, that is not an assumption. That is not even in the same time zone as blind faith. Everything we've been talking about thus far has been about the difference between blind faith, that is, faith with nothing substantial to back it up, and evidence-backed conclusions utilizing repeatable observation and reliable data, which you're wanting to call scientific faith. The consistency of the laws of physics is a textbook example of the latter. Literally 100% of the evidence that the entirety of the human species has ever encountered throughout our existence has confirmed the consistent reliability of the laws of physics. Gravity has always worked consistently, given the parameters of the mass of an object and distance between the objects. It's perfectly calculable and has never varied from the observed gravitational constant. Give you an example. If you burn your finger by poking the same hot coal 50 times in a row, it is not faith to conclude that if you poke it for the 51st time, it's going to burn your finger the same way it did the last 50 times. That is not faith. That is a sound prediction based on the repeatable, testable evidence and observation. Expecting something different from what has been consistently observed is illogical. As a matter of fact, there's an old saying about doing the same thing and expecting a different result. What was that?
The definition of insanity is doing the same exact thing over and over and expecting a different result.
And what if the laws of physics are different in different galaxies? If so, who's to say that they one day won't change in art?
We can observe other galaxies. The light from distant galaxies reaches us, and we can determine many things about those faraway stellar bodies by what we can observe, such as how those objects are moving and how they're affected by gravity, how they affect one another. In an article specifically about whether or not the constants of the universe could be different at different times or places, that cites Sean Carroll, a theoretical physicist at Caltech, says despite some tantalizing hints, the latest studies all show that changes to the fine structure constant are consistent with zero. That doesn't mean that the fine structure constant absolutely isn't changing, but if it is, it's doing so more subtly than these experiments can detect, and that seems unlikely, says Carroll. It's hard to squeeze a theory into the little daylight between not changing at all and not changing enough that we can see it. See, Daniel, this is the core difference between the kinds of faith we are talking about. You just made a bald assertion about the laws of physics possibly being different in different galaxies or changing over time, and you base that on nothing. But the evidence, which has been looked into for years and years now to determine if that very thing were happening or even possible, points to that not being the case. Thus, it is not faith, nor is it an assumption to think that the laws of physics are consistent across the universe and will remain consistent over time. That is the conclusion that is drawn from literally all of the evidence. Thinking that it's even possible to change tomorrow for no reason? That would be faith. Blind faith at that. The same kind of thing that is needed for most religious beliefs.
The reality is that there's a lot that science doesn't know and can't answer, even beyond the argument of creation. For example, science can't tell you the difference between good and evil.
Evil is an abstract! It's a human construct!
Science can't tell us that rape is wrong. Sure, we accept that as a value judgment, but science can only tell us what's observable and testable. And even then, a degree of faith and assumption making is required.
It isn't that science can't tell you the difference between good and evil. It's that science isn't even attempting to deal with things like value judgments of good and evil. I mean, it certainly can explain in extreme detail the difference between good and evil from a psychology or neurology standpoint. They can explain what goes on in the human brain when a person encounters or engages in acts that that individual determines to be good, like the dopamine that's released and thoughts and feelings of self-satisfaction, the empathy-driven feelings of happiness when one determines that they're helping others. Similarly, science can tell us what goes on physically and neurochemically when one engages in acts that they hold to be evil. And even the determination of what constitutes good and evil are explainable through the social sciences. Sociology can examine what cultural impositions of right and wrong are, which values are reinforced by the culture and which are discouraged, etc. But, strictly speaking, science does not concern itself with value judgments. Science is about what is, not about what ought. And chastising science for not giving definitive answers about morality, as if definitive answers about morality even existed, is like being mad at a lawnmower for not doing your taxes. That's not what it's for. And personally, as a moral relativist, I don't believe that there are definitive, objective moral truths. And since science is about what is, it can't possibly determine moral truths if there's no such thing as moral truths.
That's what pisses me off, because atheists basically claim that believing in the flying spaghetti monster is as ridiculous as believing in Jesus, because both require faith.
Okay, you know the whole flying spaghetti monster thing is just mockery, right? Like, you know that it isn't a real, actual argument against religion, yeah? Dude, of course there's a difference between the two. Christianity is a millennia-old belief system that grew out of pre-existing belief systems that are culturally reinforced, anthropologically relevant to how modern society developed, and constitutes an entire worldview that includes moral precepts, conceptions of universal formation, and confers externally imposed meaning upon its adherents. Pastafarianism, the flying spaghetti monster idea, contains none of those things. It's just poking fun at you religious people by comparing your deeply held spiritual conviction to literally the most ridiculous thing we could come up with. We don't compare Jesus to the flying spaghetti monster during real, actual religious debates or during actual, honest, and open conversations about belief. We do it when we're taking the piss, buddy. When we're having a laugh. Don't take everything so seriously. And when we do use the flying spaghetti monster to make a real point about religion, we're usually trying to showcase the absurdity of your belief that it seems you're only unwilling to see because of the reverence you have for your particular deity. A reverence you don't have for a flying spaghetti monster. See, most believers of any faith act like their preferred God being is so obvious and that its specific character is so commonplace in their mind that they don't even see the ridiculousness of it. But, to give you an example of it, a Christian would find the idea of Ganesha, the four-armed Hindu elephant god, to be rather silly. Or a Christian might find the stories of Anansi, the African spider god, to be mildly ridiculous. Because those god figures aren't common to you. You have no reverence for them. Those god concepts haven't been drilled into you since birth, and so you can look at them with skepticism and not the rose-colored glasses of Christian indoctrination. But you won't look at your own God concept through that same lens. And since atheists are trying to show how absurd all God concepts are, instead of singling out any one to show you how it compares to your own, we came up with a ridiculous one all of our own. The flying spaghetti monster. And it's stupid, right? Ridiculous? Bugnut crazy, right? Yeah, that's how we view your God concept.
Unlike the flying spaghetti monster, there's incredible historic evidence that backs Christianity. There are more available manuscripts of scripture than there are other historic and ancient texts that atheists have no problem believing.
No, there isn't. There is historical evidence that the figures of Christian mythology actually existed. Moses, Abraham, Jesus and the disciples, sure. But there's not one single shred of actual historical evidence for the actual supernatural aspects, which are kind of the cornerstone of actually believing in any religion. Like that Jesus walked on water, or that Moses parted the Red Sea, or that Abraham heard the actual voice of God telling him to murder his son as a goof and then told him at the last second that he was just fooling him. No actual historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead or ascended into heaven. You know, all of the actual important stuff that would need to be substantiated in order to have an evidence-based belief in the validity of the Christian religion. A justified true belief. You don't have that. You don't have anything even approaching that.
My point is that atheists are hypocritical and really dumb when they mock faith, because faith is needed in science as well.
Your point is nonsensical drivel, seeing as you entirely misconstrue the kind of faith that is used in science, which isn't even faith really, with the kind of faith that is necessary in order to accept virtually any religious belief. I mean, I know this was a fairly short video, and Daniel didn't get into any real specifics, but you can't just claim that there is all this mountain of evidence that backs up Christianity in a real trust me bro kind of rhetoric, insist that science is no better than religion, and bingo bango, claim you've just mic dropped and schooled all of us atheists. And back to the distinction between religious and science faith, let's keep in mind that the myriad of reasons why religious faith is unreliable. Things like that it often involves belief in doctrines or entities that are not empirically verifiable. How it often relies on revelation, tradition, and sacred texts, most of which are changed over time, translated, retranslated, tri-translated, quad-translated, etc., until the original meaning is lost entirely, if it hasn't been completely changed by people in power who wanted to alter it to suit their needs. How religious faith can prioritize belief and fear of what it would mean if their faith were to ever waver, over doubt and questioning, which can lead to a more refined truth. And it often is based on personal experiences, emotions, and desires that are not able to be reproduced. And the aspects of science that you want to call faith, on the other hand, are more accurately described as confidence in the scientific method. They rely on empirical evidence, observation, and experimentation. They're constantly subject to revision and refinement through rigorous testing, encouraging skepticism and critical thinking. Scientific confidence is based on the overwhelming amount of times that scientific methods have proven to be accurate. And one of the most crucial aspects of all, scientific theories are always open to be disproven, which is the exact opposite of most religious doctrines, which are imposed in such a way by the leaders of the religion that they can never be questioned. Which is why there are still, to this day, Christians who think the earth is only 6,000 years old. Because that doctrine was drilled into them with the insistence that it was absolutely infallible and could not possibly be wrong. So any evidence that contradicts that must itself be wrong. In essence, scientific faith is a trust in a process that has consistently demonstrated its ability to produce reliable and verifiable knowledge. In contrast, religious faith often centers on beliefs that transcend or exist outside the realm of empirical verification. In other words, religious faith is stubbornly held beliefs that are not based in evidence or valid reasoning, many of which have been conclusively proven wrong over time and yet still get clung onto in utter defiance of all rationality. Even if there are some religious beliefs that turn out to actually be correct, it would be accidental and pure coincidence that they actually turned out to be accurate reflections of reality. Certainly not because that's where the evidence led. And if you want to be one of those people who cling stubbornly to beliefs that you have no good reason to assert, fine, you can do that. You have that right. But what you cannot do is try to put those beliefs on the same pedestal as scientific inquiry and expect to not get laughed out of the room. What you cannot do is insist that your spiritual assertions are perfectly reasonable and logical to non-believers, thereby implying that our non-acceptance of those beliefs makes us unreasonable and illogical. What you cannot do is state with your full chest that you've got the same kind of evidence and reason on the side of Christianity as gravitational theory and the laws of physics. Not without expecting to get mocked relentlessly with tales of the flying spaghetti monster, or just with finely dressed pink cycloptic tribbles taking you to task for being the blindly faithful, irrational, unsubstantiated, bald asserters and unseeing assumer that you are. And so that is where we'll end things for today. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Check me out on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Patreon if you'd like to support my work directly. My Teespring if you want some Plinky merchandise, all that linked below in the description. Special shout out to my most recent super thankers here on YouTube, Powell B, Nightwing 4, and Autumnal Fling. And with that said, until next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.